Some wars change the world. They are titanic events where glory mixes with horror, the greatest stories ever told. This is not one of those stories. This is a small war happening under the shadow of a larger one. A footnote in history, but still worthy of a little bit of analysis. The story begins not in a battlefield, but in a map. Look at Europe in 1620 and you'll see the Habsburgs everywhere. Spain under Philip III, Austria under Ferdinand II, both branches tied by blood and ambition. Between them lies France, Catholic in faith, but surrounded by Catholic powers it fears more than it trusts. In between Austria and Spain lies Italy, specifically Milan and the Tyrol. There lies a narrow valley few had ever heard of, the Valtellina. It is a corridor of stone and snow, barely 100 kilometers long. Yet, it held the key to keeping the Habsburg Empire connected. Since the late 16th century, Spanish troops bound for the Netherlands had marched along the Camino Español, the Spanish Road, a chain of loyal territories stretching from Genoa through Lombardy and up the Alpine passes into Austria, then into the Rhineland and Flanders. It was the safest way to send gold, letters, and men to crush Protestant rebellion in the north without crossing seas infested with English or Dutch ships. The Valtellina was ruled by the 3 leagues of the Grisons, sorry for the pronunciation, a Protestant republic in the Swiss Confederacy. It was a bottleneck in the Spanish road, a location where it could be broken like a bone out of place. It was the one segment not directly under Spain control, a secret weak point that could be exploited if ever discovered. The inhabitants of the valley were Catholic, deeply so. Their faith wasn't merely ritual, it was identity. For them, Zurich and Genoa were alien, heretical, almost foreign. They spoke their own Italian dialect, looked to Milan for trade, to Rome for absolution. Yet they were taxed and governed by Protestant officials from Chur, who imposed not only fiscal burdens, but also the spirit of the Reformation. Restrictions on Catholic clergy, suppression of processions, confiscation of tithes. It was a small colonial dominion built on resentment, and resentment is the perfect soil for intrigue. Spain did notice this. The Duke of Feria, governor of Milan, warned that losing the Valtellina meant losing the empire arteries. In Madrid, the Council of State debated whether to openly intervene, but even before decisions were made, Jesuit confessors and Milanese agents began to work among the villagers, founding altars, arming militias, whispering of liberation in the name of the church. France saw this too. Richelieu, not yet the towering minister he would become, watched as the Habsburg garrison pressed against every frontier. To him, the Valtellina was more than a valley, it was a lever. If France could control it, even indirectly, she could choke the Spanish road and bleed Spanish power in Flanders without firing a single cannon. But the local stage was even more tangled. That peculiar Swiss federation of mountain leagues dominating the area were divided themselves. Catholics in the Grey League, Protestants in the God's House and the 10 jurisdictions. Their fragile unity depended on balancing faith with mutual self-interest, and the Valtellina rebellion threatened to shatter it. The Valley Catholic elite, the De Vanosta, the Quadrio, the Guicciardi family, began to petition for autonomy, then for separation. Each side, in truth, served someone else's ambition. The Habsburg dreamed of securing the Alpine spine, France dreamed of cutting it. In all of this, by 1620, Europe was already burning. Bohemia had risen against Ferdinand II, the Battle of the White Mountain loomed, the Palatinate was collapsing under Catholic arms. What happened next in this remote Alpine corner would echo across that chaos. We are talking about the beginnings of the 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in Europe at the time. The main event of the first half of the modern age, the season finale of the Reformation and the religious wars. Valtellina was practically just a road, but what happened there had the potential of influencing the entirety of the conflict, the entirety of Europe. And so came the first blood. In the spring of 1620, the valley was a tinderbox. The Protestant Grisons, weakened by internal divisions, had begun to lose their grip. Among the leading figures of the Catholic faction was Giacomo Robustelli, a nobleman of Sondrio whose family had long resented Grison rule. He was well connected to Milan, and through Milan to the Spanish governor, the Duke of Feria, who quietly supplied him with weapons and assurances that His Majesty of Spain would look with favor on a defense of the faith. The plan, whispered through monasteries and family networks, was a ruthless and simple one. Seize the strongholds held by the Grisons, annihilate the Protestant presence in the valley, secure the last step of the Spanish road, making it completely safe and defendable. Priests would bless the arms of the faithful. Church bells would be the signal. The conspirators promised mercy to no one. At dawn, it began in Tirano. The rebels, wearing crosses on their chests, stormed the houses of Protestant officials, dragging them into the streets. Witnesses later recalled the cry, "Viva la fede cattolica!" echoing from the streets. Hooray for the Catholic faith could be a good translation. The pastor of the Reformed Church was killed at the altar. Others were cut down while attempting to flee into the vineyards. The uprising spread like wildfire. Teglio, Sondrio, Bormio, each town echoing the same script. Protestant garrisons were overwhelmed. Families who had lived in the valley for generations were butchered in their beds. Some were thrown into the Adda River. Others were locked in barns and burned alive. Contemporary reports, like those gathered by Venetian envoys and later compiled by Jesuit historian Danielo Bartoli, vary in number, but most estimate between 500 and 600 dead in the first days. For a valley of scarcely 30,000 people, it was no joke. The massacre was framed as a Catholic liberation, a spontaneous rebellion part of the many religious wars going through Europe, but its precision betrayed orchestration. Robustelli's men spared not only local Catholics, but also Spanish merchants, suggesting that the Milanese government had known more than it admitted. Where once a mixed league of alliances held the valley and made it stable, now the stability was broken. Spain was gonna take everything and eliminate the risk factor. When surviving Grisons officials tried to retreat north toward Chiavenna, the mountain passes were already blocked. The rebels had sealed the valley, turning it into a fortress. They proclaimed a new government, a Holy League of the Catholic Faith, under the protection of the Pope and His Catholic Majesty of Spain. Spanish officers arrived soon after, ostensibly as peacemakers, occupying the key fortresses of Tirano and Teglio. The Duke of Feria issued polite denials to Venice and France, claiming that Spain had nothing to do with the internal affairs of the valley, yet his troops now stood on the only road connecting Milan to the Tyrol. In France, the news landed like a spark on dry powder. Richelieu, still formally only a royal minister, saw the move for what it was, a quiet extension of Habsburg power under the veil of religion. Spain had secured the Alps without declaring war, and France, still recovering from their own civil wars, could do little but watch. Yet Richelieu understood the long game. He saw that once the Valtellina was lost, the Habsburg would dominate the passes, encircle France, and control the logistics of every Catholic army in Europe. If France ever meant to survive as an independent power, the road through the valley would have to be broken. But for the moment, Europe watched in horror. Protestant pamphlets from Zurich and Basel denounced the pogrom of the Grisons. They printed gruesome woodcuts of the killings. The Catholic world, for its part, celebrated its divine justice. The Pope envoys offered blessings to the new rulers of the valley, and Rome briefly dreamed of establishing a papal protectorate over the region, a miniature theocracy in the heart of the Alps. And so the great chess game began. By the early 1620s, the Valtellina was quiet again, but it was the silence of occupation. Spanish tercios garrisoned its towers under the pretext of protecting the Catholic population. The Duke of Feria in Milan assured every court in Europe that Spain sought nothing but stability. To the Pope, he sent letters speaking of defending the faith against heresy. To Venice and Savoy, he promised that no fortress would ever threaten the passes. In truth, every fort built on the Adda River tightened the Habsburg grip on the Alps. They were giving empty promises and using the fact that information around the Alpine Pass moved slowly to make the situation a fact incontestable after being completed. Then, in 1624, everything changed. Armand Jean Duplessis, otherwise known as the already cited Cardinal Richelieu, entered the council of the king. Richelieu was a paradox incarnate, a prince of the church who distrusted Rome, a servant of a Catholic king who saw Catholic Spain as the mortal enemy of France. He was able to see the geometry of power. A state has no religion but its interests, he would later write, and nowhere was that creed more visible than in Valtellina. With the hinge of the Habsburg encirclement of France tightening in the valley, he needed to act, cloaking strategy in sanctity. In 1623, Pope Gregory XV, alarmed by the rising tension between France and Spain, sent his nephew, Cardinal Ludovisi, as papal legate to restore order in the valley. A papal army, recruited largely in Italy and nominally neutral, entered the Valtellina and took control of its fortresses from the Spanish. To most observers, it seemed a triumph of diplomacy. Spain had withdrawn, France had avoided open conflict, and the valley was now in the hands of the Holy See, a perfect Catholic compromise. Richelieu, though, was able to see through it. The papal garrisons were in practice dependent on Spanish supply lines from Milan. The Pope, meanwhile, was changing. Fate wanted that Gregory XV dies in 1623, and his successor, Urban VIII, Barberini, was less sympathetic to the Habsburg power. Richelieu moved swiftly. He promised to protect the papal states in Italy, flattered Urban with talk of restoring the balance of Christendom, and quietly prepared for intervention. By 1624, France had formed an alliance with Venice and Savoy, two powers equally threatened by Spanish expansion. Their secret agreement, the League of the Alps, called for joint military action to expel all foreign troops from the Valtellina and restore the territory to the Grisons under the Catholic guarantee. It was in essence a cover for French entry into northern Italy. In the summer of 1624, French troops under François Hannibal d'Estrées crossed into the Grisons' territory. Officially, they came to support a papal mission. In reality, they came to force Spain out. The campaign was as much theater as warfare. French and papal envoys exchanged letters of courtesy, while soldiers maneuvered for control of the passes. Skirmishes broke out near Tirano and Bormio. Spanish officers complained that their neutrality was violated. Richelieu countered that France was merely helping His Holiness secure peace. Venetian's records describe the scene vividly. The mountains are full of banners and crosses. Every army claims to march in God's name, and none for his peace. So we have three armies skirmishing slowly between Alpine passes. They fight sometimes, but always in small groups. After all, to fight in the Alps isn't easy, especially if you fight for passes. To attack a garrisoned Alpine pass is suicide. So it was more about movement, maneuvers, trying to get the passes and hold it as long as possible, both against the skirmishing of the other opponents and the weather itself. By the late 1625, the papal forces had withdrawn, unable to sustain their position between the two rival Catholic powers. French troops occupied the key fortresses and refused to leave. Richelieu had achieved what Spain had in 1620, control of the valley without a formal declaration of war, but its control was diplomatic rather than military. He had managed to make France appear as the protector of both the Pope and the Grisons, while quietly dismantling the last link of the Spanish road. The Habsburg were furious. In Madrid, the Count Duke of Olivares called it a dagger placed at the heart of the empire. In Vienna, Ferdinand II fumed that France, a Catholic kingdom, had become the shield of the heretics, but neither could act. Spain was drained by the Dutch War. Austria was fighting in Germany, and the passes of the Alps, at the moment, belonged to Richelieu. Spain had tried to take control of the passes using the papal forces, but the papal forces were unable to withstand France, and France had found its own way to enter the valley without declaring war. Thus began one of the strangest peace negotiations of the 30 Years' War. Two powers who refused to recognize each other's legitimacy in the valley agreed to meet in a neutral city, Monzón, in Aragonese territory, chosen precisely because it lay far from the mountains that had caused so much trouble. The negotiators arrived in spring. The emissary of Cardinal Richelieu was Father Joseph, the so-called Eminence Gris. On the other side was Don Inigo Velez de Guevara, representing Olivares. For 2 months, they circled each other in a conversation as precise and layered as a duel. France demanded that the Grisons be restored to their sovereignty. Spain insisted that the valley remain Catholic and that no Protestant troops ever pass through. Both, hypocritically, agreed that the Pope should serve as a moral arbiter. When the treaty was signed in March 1626, it was worded with exquisite ambiguity, a masterpiece of diplomatic fiction. The Grisons recovered political control of the Valtellina, but only under the condition that its inhabitants retain their Catholic faith and that no Protestant preaching or governance be re-established. The fortresses were to be dismantled, the Spanish and French troops withdrawn, and the Pope would guarantee the neutrality of the passes. On paper, it was a balanced peace. Everyone gained something, everyone lost something. In practice, it was a French victory in all but name. Spain's road to the Tyrol was broken. No longer could Tertius march unhindered from Milan to Flanders. The Alps were neutralized, and France, by defending Catholic liberty, had achieved a strategic triumph that armies could not. Richelieu emerged as Europe's quiet arbiter. Even in his private memoirs, he treated Monzón not as a climax, but as a rehearsal, a diplomatic overture to the far larger struggle to come. We must prepare France to act not merely as a kingdom, but as the heart of Christendom, he wrote. Within a decade, he would lead France directly into the 30 Years' War, turning against the Habsburgs, who he had just outmaneuvered. For the people of the Valtellina, the war left little but scars. The valley remained Catholic, its autonomy more illusion than reality. The Grisons returned in name but never in authority. Spanish and French spies still met in its monasteries. Priests still whispered allegiances to rival kings, and the Adda River still ran past the ruin of churches burned in 1620. Yet no great power cared anymore. The valley had served its purpose. It had been a pawn, played and discarded. Historians remember the great wars for their thunder, their sieges, the empires, the kings who marched beneath banners and prayers, but the war in the Valtellina was fought in whispers. It never had its version of the White Mountain battle. Its battlefields were villages, the generals were diplomats, and its victories were drawn in ink, not blood. Yet, in those 6 years of struggle between peasants with muskets, cardinals with maps, and monarchs who fought through proxies, Europe rehearsed the logic of the entire century. that faith was no longer a compass but a currency. It's easy to overlook such a war, to see it as a provincial quarrel in the shadow of empires. But look closer and you'll see the blueprint of the modern state taking form. The Valais rebellion, born in faith and fury, was crushed and redrawn by ministers who spoke the new language of raison d'etat, the reason of state. Here, the principles of medieval Christendom died quickly, replaced by balance, strategy, and the cold mathematical of survival. When the 30 Years' War finally consumed the continent, this was the world it inherited. A Europe where a defense of the faith meant a defense of power, and where cardinals could send armies across mountains in the name of peace. Today, the Valtellina is serene again, vineyards climbing its slopes, churches rebuilt, the Adda gliding quietly toward Lake Como. Nothing remains of the fortresses or the fires of 1620, but if you walk its narrow roads and listen, you can still sense the echo of that hidden war. A whisper between stones that say the fate of empire is often decided not on the open plain, but in the silence of a valley no one remembers.